Hello, my name is Mingyan Kim. I'm a senior at Carnegie Mellon University, majoring in chemical engineering and biomedical engineering. I conduct research at CMU under the supervision of Professor Garoff and Professor Tilton. The main focus of my research project lies in investigating the deformation patterns of surfactant-containing droplets upon contact. As for the motivation, in 2021 alone, there has been 3.5 million patients who died suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, also known as COPD, according to the World Health Organization. Despite the gravity of the issue at hand, there has been minimal research done on investigating and further polishing the treatment for this. The most prevalent treatment, which relies on respiratory devices such as nebulizers, presents a critical limitation. The purpose of these devices is to aid in drug delivery to the lungs as patients inhale through them. However, patients suffering from COPD also suffer from heterogeneous lung pathology, where there are spatial differences in airflow resistance and ventilation perfusion ratios. This often results in an inadequate spreading of the drug, leaving critical areas of the lungs being untreated. To enhance the spreading of the drug, the impact of surfactant has been investigated. However, there has been minimal research done on how multiple surfactant containing droplets would interact together in a viscous surface that could possibly mimic the human mucus. For this reason, this is the main motivation of my project, which is to study how multiple droplets would interact together in a possible real-life situation. As for the background, as I briefly mentioned, surfactants do augment the spreading of the drops after deposition on a clean liquid surface. So here I have a diagram. The surfactant containing droplet, imagine a surfactant containing droplet comes down to meet a surfactant-free liquid surface. And as the drop comes down and gets deposited, where we have the surfactant drop and where we have the surface, right between them, we would have a boundary where we would see some concentration gradient in the surfactants because our surfactant containing drop has a lot of surfactants, whereas the surface is initially clean and is surfactant free basically. And because the nature of physics wants to minimize the concentration gradient, it would induce a Marangoni flow, which is essentially a convective flow that would try to spread out the surfactants as much as possible. And in this manner, we are able to achieve mass transfer because whatever we put inside that surfactant containing droplet would also get transferred along as the surfactants are getting traveled. As I mentioned above, the main objective of my research project is to investigate how multiple surfactant-containing droplets would interact together on a clean liquid surface. Moving on to the method section, so surfactants are when you mix surfactants with liquid, they get dissolved and they're just clear solutions that aren't differentiable from, let's say, like water or any other transparent liquids. And hence visually visually observe the spreading of surfactant containing droplets, I also added some fluorescent dye in here, and hence I also had to add a UV flashlight to be able to observe the green part of the drops. And I also employed a multi-channel micropipette to deposit multiple droplets simultaneously. Moving on to the results section, as drops merge, we see some corners and ridges forming. So what I have up here is a top view of two drops interacting together, and I also have the timestamps. And you will see that as drops get nearby, you would see this like faint black line that is sitting between these two drops, and you would also see these corners, which is quite intriguing because they are refusing to get coalesced initially. And eventually, we still see the faint line for a bit. However, eventually merge, and also the corners would also start to fade away. Another important observation that I would like to point out is the ridges. So the ridges are like essentially the brighter green regions. For example, in image B, it will be here, and image C, it will be here. I assume you'll be wondering what a ridge is, and a ridge is essentially like these bright regions that I indicated with some arrows, and I also indicated the gap for the black line. So a ridge would form because as two drops are approaching each other, they will want to meet, but initially there are some hydrodynamic forces that prevent them from being coalesced initially. But since the drops would still want to continue spreading, but because there's some hydrodynamic force going repulsion happening at the middle, they would either have to travel upwards or downwards in the negative z direction. However, in the negative z direction, we already have the viscous subface, but up in the positive z direction, it's just air. And hence, because the drops hence, because it requires less energy for the drops to move towards a section that is completely free of some liquids, they would decide to move in the positive z direction, and therefore we would see some accumulation of the drops in the positive z direction. And that's why the drops would accumulate, and because we are using some fluorescent dye to indicate the boundaries, we would see an accumulation of it and it would appear as brighter green. And some important frames to note is that the formation of the ridges are apparent even before the gap closure. So if I zoom in here, we would see the ridges forming. However, these ridges form even before the gap is closed because we see this black lines between there. And I mentioned this part earlier that the ridges would form upwards because if the drops are trying to go in the negative z direction, there's more resistance due to the liquid that's already underneath, and it cannot travel in this direction either because there's a hydrodynamic repulsion that is preventing the initial coalescence of these drops. And upon touching, the bigger drop, which is the top drop in this image, has more pointy edges and boundary curved towards the bigger drop. So I marked the boundary curved with a red curve, and we see that the top drop, which is a bigger drop in this image, has more pointy edges than the drop that is underneath. And eventually we see that the ridges fade away as the gap closes. So here we see that the ridges fade away and the gap has been closed. And the ridges also disappear eventually. The main conclusion of my research project is that the drops did not just merge, and deformation is greater for the bigger drop. Initially, drops resist on merging, and ridges are formed before the gap closure, and the bigger drops deforms more because it has more pointy edges and the boundary is curved towards a bigger drop. And the ridges eventually fade away. In terms of future work, I would like to quantify the ridge formation and disappearance through intensity, and adding talc to the liquid surface to visualize the flow field would be important. And I have been funded by the Summer Undergrad Research Fellowship from Carnegie Mellon University to pursue this research. Thank you.